Time to do that July reading wrap-up, starting with our 2-star reads. Everywhere You Look by Liv Constantine. This is part of the Amazon original Never Tell collection, and as such I'll be doing a standalone video on it later. But to me, this was not a good story. It was so generic, bland, and predictable. I knew exactly what was happening, why it was happening. It tried to be twisty-turny, and I didn't, buy into any of that or care about it. I was not invested in this lead character. I didn't care about her story. I didn't care about her dad. Like, the whole thing was so flat. And the writing was like very meh. Like, it wasn't bad writing, there wasn't a bunch of grammar, spelling issues, at least not in the audio version I listened to. It also didn't stand out, it wasn't striking or intriguing or drawing me in. I was torn between making this a 2-star read and a 3-star read because it's so generic and bland and underwhelming, but like, it doesn't necessarily suck, I just didn't like it. But I decided eventually it belonged here at 2 stars because it's supposed to be a thriller, because it's supposed to be tense, fast-paced. I'm supposed to be wondering what's going to be happening. I'm supposed to feel invested and guessing and feeling like hooked till the end, and it fails. So as a piece of literature out there in the world, it's maybe like 3 stars, but as a thriller specifically, it's only a 2. Moving into 3-star reads. Seed by Anya Ailborn. To me, this was really just a kind of basic story. Like, I listened all the way through this and it was fine, but there was nothing in it that made me wonder where the story was going or what was going to happen. Instead, I was really like sitting back in like my reader author like mind palace, making a bunch of comparisons with all of the other works that I've read by Anya Ailborn before this, and thinking like,
she really does the same thing the same way all the flippin' time.
Generally, there are always a couple wildcard elements that lack complete cohesion in her story. Like, she does, as an author, successfully tie them back into the main whatever, but at the same time, you're like,
that's just kind of weird, doesn't fit.
And then as far as like the writing goes, I found this to be like very terse and uninteresting stylistically. And the last thing I read by her, If You See Her, I think there was some effort to do something that was stylistically different, and it was done in a way that was like more interesting and dynamic, and where I kept like turning pages and was interested to get to the end and figure out what was going on. At no point in this was there any like move towards style. It was the most generic writing I feel like you could imagine. I think maybe it was looking to bring in like some of that southern drawl and like flat, there it is kind of feeling, but it's not doing it super well. There's like this open question in the story about whether or not the guy is being secretive or he literally can't tell his wife about things. The narrative plays back and forth with this, like, will he tell her, won't he tell her, will he be allowed to tell her? We don't really get a very clear answer on where that lands. He gets a confrontation with a truck driver that's incredibly unsatisfying, even though it quote-unquote like ties back into everything else that happens. To me, that's probably the biggest example in this book of an element of the story that quote-unquote ties in, but it is so unsatisfying, it doesn't really feel like it makes sense or should have gone into the story. I did listen to this rather than read it on my Kindle, and that's probably the only reason I managed to get through this book. If you've read Seed and you liked it, I guess I can see a couple elements that might appeal to some readers in some circumstances. It does like have a little bit of a Pet Sematary vibe going on, like with some creepy kid elements, family trauma, legacy kind of things. I just don't think it really executed in a way that I found to be enjoyable. Next is going to be These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. I DNF'd this at 10%. I was so excited to see this book on Kindle Unlimited. I've always been really curious about like this alternative Romeo Juliet version in Shanghai, and I love the idea of a cosmic horror being in Shanghai in this time, and like the gangs having to put whatever their issue is aside to deal with that. But honestly, I fell asleep twice in the middle of the day while trying to read this story, and I wasn't tired or like for lack of sleep. It was just that boring to me. I don't even know what I didn't like or what didn't appeal to me about the story, but it was starting to put me into a slump, and I was looking over at Heather at Hia Booktubes, like all the things she DNF'd and why, and trying to like sort of convince myself to let this book go. And she encouraged me, whatever the book was, put it down, so that's what I did. I'd be interested in reading something else by Chloe Gong in the future, just to see like what her style actually is, and if she can pull something that's like her own story off better than this Romeo Juliet. I think think too, if I'd continued with this story, I probably would have had some issues with the young adult portions of it. I'm not a young adult reader anymore. Next is going to be The Bird Eater by Anya Ailborn. This was better than Seed by a lot. I felt like there were some interesting ideas and concepts. I felt like the character was more compelling. I liked the open in the haunted house with an aunt, and then I liked the young nephew coming back after all this time to like clean up and sell a house. That said, I didn't even end up finishing this book. I think I put it down at like 60%. What ended up happening is the kid has this friend Eric who's been living in the town. He is in charge of a paranormal society, and he's like really passionate about this paranormal society even though it hasn't taken off or whatever. The main character goes to him and is like,
"Hey, could you do like some paranormal stuff in my house? I think there might be something going on."
and he's like,
Nah, I don't have the equipment.
and he's so like unconfident about his paranormal thing and blah 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 blah. I was like,
Oh, this is such a long side tangent. Why did we even bring the paranormal stuff up if we weren't going to do anything with it?
and it just turned me off to these characters, the scenario, the book, and where this could possibly go from here. Next is going to be Scorpions by Rachel Halsell Hall. This is also part of the Never Tell Amazon original collection. I think the story was too long. We like over focused on the main character's emotions and like repeating her trauma from childhood and how it was like still coming to chase her and she was like a bad seed or a bad person or whatever. Most everything in this story was executed adequately, but none of it was going above and beyond. Like, I don't mind the surprise heist. I don't mind the morally gray character. I thought it was a little bit preachy in that she was surrounded by a lot of like bad to morally gray characters, but for some reason she was the only one we were supposed to empathize with or feel like could get a redemption arc or like deserved things. And granted, it's a very short story, so maybe there just wasn't enough breathing room to give like a more humane approach to these other characters, but it was a little off-putting. The story is also trying to do something like back and forth in time, like it jump cuts us to this moment where she's like already in a heist gone bad, and then we jump 3 days back and start from there moving forward. It's executed adequately, and to be fair to the story, I think whether you told it forward in time or backward in time, I think it's a good, interesting story. But number one, I don't really like that technique, and number two, it's only adequate. Like, I don't really know why it's there. It doesn't like provide interest or color as much as I think maybe the author was going for. This author is a good writer and is worth reading more books from. In fact, I read These Toxic Things last month and loved it from her, but I don't think this is her best showing by any stretch. Next is going to be Moonfire Brides by Sylvia Mercedes. The construction on this book was decent. And props to Mercedes here because the main character here is definitely not a self-insert. And you know why I know that? Because I hated every minute with her. And I was like fighting with her in the narrative all the time.
Why is this the decision we're going with? What makes her think this is the right way to go about this?
Even though she would have like a flash of insight, instead of chasing that, she'd go off and be silly and frivolous. And I don't know that I bought this relationship between her and her sister and like her need to get back to her sister. Because early on, she talks about how her sister's like brave, outgoing, always going out into like these fairy woods, and one day she wasn't going to come back. It was something like the older sister has kind of made peace with. She just doesn't think it should happen when she's a child.
Girlie, if you know that this is who your sister is and you've accepted it, don't just keep trying to pull her back and force her to be something or someone she's not.
It seemed to me that the younger sister resented her older sister a lot. So I didn't care for that element either. Like, the older sister was devoted, willing to sacrifice everything and anything for the younger sister. To be really honest, this is another book I should have DNF'd pretty much as soon as I realized I didn't like this character. Because while the plot is interesting, while there's great lore going on, and while I do really appreciate the way this slow burn romance comes about, and I appreciate that it's a slow burn romance, I just can't root for this protagonist. She's just so frustrating. And to that end, even though it's a really good book, and if you like this protagonist and you like slow burn romance, you will like this book. I won't be reading the next book in the series because I do not like this protagonist and I don't want to go on any more journeys with her. Which moves us into 4-star reads. Starting with The Alpha Club by Roxy Collins. This is a fun Omegaverse Why Choose romance. I mentioned it in my mid-year freakout tag, and I think I said that this was actually going to be a beta romance in an Omega world, and it turns out that's not the case. It is an Omega romance. I was still okay with that because in the first in this series, we follow Grace, who was a beta, and her stepbrother's pack was like trying to claim her, and there was also this Omega they were trying to claim who was helping her escape. And this story is about that Omega trying to escape from like this bad pack and like finding love of her own someplace else. So I was really on board for this character. I also love that she was not a very stereotypical Omega. She's like planning her own escape. She's making daring, bold moves. She's sort of like secretly rebelling and standing up for the Alpha instead of doing these head-to-head matches she can't win. And it does take the love interest like some time and energy to earn her trust. They only even get that opportunity because she has an immediate connection with an Omega who's in their care, so it's like an Omega romance before anything else, which I'm always down for these unusual pairings in the Alpha Omega world. I don't think this one did as good a job as the last one in giving everyone a moment to be their own character and shine. I think there was a little bit like more action and things they had to wrap up. And this is a general complaint I have in why I choose romances as a whole, because there's so much going on with so many different love interests. They don't need larger plots most of the time. And when you incorporate a larger plot, a lot of times what gets short-shifted are these character relationships, developmental moments. Roxy Collins does an okay job balancing these two elements, and the larger world stuff is interesting. I'm invested in that story too. Some of this larger world building stuff has to happen so that Jasmine, our main character, feels secure enough to actually be in a relationship and have all this time to like take care of herself and her sister and whatnot. I think what they could have cut to like increase the world building and give us more time to develop these characters is like going back to Grace and her pack. And I didn't particularly appreciate them revisiting Grace and everyone being like she's a super special beta, super special, more special than anyone else. Like, it was good in her own book when she needed that moment to like boost her confidence and step into herself and become who she was meant to be. But here, for everyone else to like be worshiping her and talking about how great she is and honored and special she is, it makes it seem less like a moment about how everyone in a society, regardless of their station, has value and merit, and more like a Grace is the specialist snowflake party. You know, but I still love the writing. I like this Alpha Omega world Roxy Collins has created. I'd love to see more from it, even though I know this series is complete. Next is going to be The Ghostwriter by Lorth Ann White, also part of the Nevertell collection. I love this because it's a twisty-turny gothic mystery. I was a little nervous going into it because in the intro there's a lot of alliteration and whimsy fairy tale elements, and it feels very corny and fake. We get a little further in, we dial back on that, and we also have like a good reason for those elements to exist, and suddenly it starts to feel like dark and mysterious and like brooding in a way that it didn't in the intro. I liked it. It kept me very investing from beginning to end. It's not very long, definitely worth your time. Next is going to be The Other Side of the Road by Andrea Bartz. This is also part of the Nevertell collection. I was originally on the fence about whether this was a 3-star or a 4-star read because I knew like from the first 2 lines what was going to happen and who was the guilty party. Upon reflection, I felt like this was actually seeding out breadcrumbs, and for like there to be a good thriller or whatever, you want to sort of solve the mystery along with the characters, so the writer has to create these like little breadcrumb tell moments that you can like reference at the end and be like,
oh yeah, of course they're the one who did it.
some people are going to be able to pick up on that and know right away, and some people are not. In this case, with this story, I was able to pick up right away. But I think it's a feature and not a bug, because I think about how mad and unsatisfied I would have been if it was just like rando McRanderson who popped out of a bush and there'd been no hints about who'd been the guy. Also, I like how it handles like the relationship, this one woman's like continued fear of men and how that's like driving her to make assumptions about people and to go to the wrong direction, and how like this fear has sort of been driving her whole life. I also like the conversation between like city living and suburb living, and which has safer or like is better for you in general, all that kind of stuff. Like, it's old and rehashed, but it's fine to add that flavor, that extra theming into a story, you know? And last is going to be 5-star reads. I reread The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. Fair warning, this story is probably very triggering to a lot of modern audiences is because not only does it have domestic violence and addiction in it, but it has a lot of animal violence in it as well. But if you're okay with those things, then this is a great story. It's only a 30-minute read if you're listening to it, and it's probably closer to like 20 minutes if you're reading it because it's so short. It brings the creep factor, it brings like a portrait of an insane person like really into focus. I just think it's doing a lot of things really well in a very tight time limit. As a whole, Edgar Allan Poe is pretty wordy, and this isn't necessarily an exception. There are paragraphs in between each one of the action elements talking about how this like person felt or thought about it at the time and how they're feeling and thinking about it now. There's this like superstition through line in it that like he keeps bringing up and being like, but I'm not superstitious, I just happen to mention it because I'm thinking of it now. You know, all these unreliable narration elements, all these like bad person narration elements is very interesting. And I think it's horrifying in a lot of ways. Like first there is the brutality he's committing against animals and his wife. Then there's his insanity. There's like elements about him that feel like he is the beginning level of serial killer. It's great psychological gore, gothic horror, like classic potential supernatural evil element. Do you believe in that? Do you believe in the evil inherent in man? It's doing all those things really well, and Poe is the master of this kind of horror for a reason. And that's going to be everything I've read this past July. But talk to me in those comments down below. What was your favorite read this July and why? Thank you guys for watching, and as always, keep reading.